Why can't she just put it in the post box? Then I don't have to have on my Ring doorbell seeing my mum come to my door when she, as far as she's concerned, I'm dead. Bear in mind, I was the abused here. So explain why I might be so triggered by that.
I'll say it for what I believe it is, which is an opportunity to abuse you from afar.
Yes.
It's a power play. They know exactly what they're doing, right? They know exactly what they're doing. And it's very difficult to call out. But that's why we need to talk about it. That's why it needs calling out in that way. One of the things that get leveled at me, particularly with my content, people will say, you seem angry when you talk about this stuff. And I always say, like, well, my question is to you, when you're talking about parental abuse, why aren't you angry?
Yeah. What about this doesn't make you angry?
Yeah. Why you should be angry. Like anger's not bad, right?
It's there for a reason. We forget this. We feel it for a reason. We're supposed to feel it. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you. Good to be here. Very excited.
Very good.
Yeah.
I, for those of my followers and listeners that know you, this is Josh Connolly. And you've recently written this book, which I'm going to show to the camera. So this book, which you kindly sent to me, it's Them, Not You. This is about toxic parenting, how to break free of it. So the reason I followed you on Instagram originally, as I've said to you before, is that I had a lot of clients that said, oh, have you seen Josh Connolly on Instagram? So I came across your stuff and I was just like, wow, this guy articulates everything that I think so many of us that have been through abuse or addiction with our parents don't know how to say. And even if we do know how to say it, somehow you just say it clearer. There's more clarity and there's more articulation. And what you were saying really resonated. And it's hard because, as you know yourself, and we'll find out more about you, but when you've got toxic parents, your siblings and the people around your parents will often support them and make up excuses for them. And you can feel very, very abandoned by that whole experience. So I started to watch your things, and there was something that you said particularly, which I'll go into later, which might seem like nothing to other people. But for me, it was really, really profound. And I kind of want to go into that a bit later. But this book's really good because it's one of those books where you could open it on any page and you will find something that resonates with you if you have toxic parents. Yes, read it from beginning to end as I have, but that's what I thought when I'd finished it, that this is that book where you pick it up anywhere, you get your highlighter out and there'd be several different things that you go, oh God, yes. But it's really useful how-to as well. It's not just a book about your story, it's how to heal from your own experience. And so with that, it's important to say what you do as well as the author. You're a coach, but you work with the somatic experiencing side of things, so breathwork. And I know that you really focus on trauma trapped in the body, which again is quite, I guess, misunderstood by people that don't necessarily follow a lot of people that talk about this. So I really want to dive into that today. But I also want to start with your personal story. And we always go back to childhood for this, because this is where people will really start to recognise themselves in you. So when was your first kind of understanding, I guess, that maybe you weren't having the best experience? That could be very, very early for some people and later for others.
I think, like, what's important to kind of say is that when I was like 24, right? So this is in adulthood. If you'd have asked me about my childhood, I would have told you that it was perfect.
Yeah.
Pretty idyllic. My dad died when I was young, but I don't really remember him. And that was the kind of narrative that I had sort of told myself. And the truth is that I felt like I couldn't really remember anything, which is like, there's still a level of truth in that. Like I can't recall a lot of stuff, but my sort of implicit memory is what I've been able to explore more. So there's a level of like hypothesizing that I do, but there's also that comes from a knowing. And I think the more that we are able to lean into our bodies and listen to what it's telling us, we don't necessarily always need to be able to perfectly recall what we experienced.
It's so true. It's so true, because you think you're recalling what you experienced, but it's your perception of what happened, and it's usually through the eyes of the child that you were, which doesn't mean it's not true, but that could be laid with either hypervigilance or disassociation.
Yeah. And as well as the narrative of the people around you at the time of the things that happened.
Exactly, what you've been told about what happened.
Yeah, so like my mum told me one of her ways of like dealing with it was to tell herself and me that I don't remember that, right? You were too young. You don't remember what happened with your dad. Fortunately, you were too young to remember it. So that was the narrative that I also told myself.
Right.
But then when my first daughter, who's now 18, when she reached 9 years old, which was the age when I lost my dad, I had like a mini sort of breakdown, really, in many ways, because I was looking at my daughter thinking, if something like that happened to her, she'd remember all of it. Like, she's not too young to remember this. Like, she's very well formed and made up in herself. And so then I had to start unpacking a lot more of the truths, and the truths that I lived with, particularly in the initial years, was there was a lot of chaos. My dad was quite a sort of angry, chaotic man. And I think as a result of that, what's more important to understand is like the behaviors that surrounded those experiences. So it's very easy for us to go straight to, I saw my dad smash the house up. I heard my dad physically fighting my mum, and all of those things are like really difficult to have experienced and to have dealt with. But the more prominent wounding that I experienced as a child was the fact that we had to then keep that a secret from ourselves as well as the people around us. So the morning after, the night before, everybody's acting like everything's normal and like there's nothing to see here, both in the home and then you take that outside of the home too. And so when you are consistently and constantly denying your reality, and your reality is scary and hard to comprehend in itself, you can start to see how and why we may find ourselves struggling with how we feel when we're adults. And you don't necessarily need to be able to recall all of the moments to recognize and understand the impact that has on our, and I would say on our mind and our bodies, because that's important.
Yeah, and I always think they're the same thing anyway. Mm-hmm. And, when we talk about the mind, I always try and encourage people to remember I'm talking about your whole system. Mm-hmm. Because to separate it doesn't seem right anymore with all of the sort of movement in that area of somatic experiencing and, sound movement. It just doesn't feel right to separate the mind from the body now.
And you often hear, like, with the big sort of mental health movement that's happened in more recent years, you often hear people say that mental health is just as important as physical health. And I sort of say that separating the two in that way, the body doesn't do that.
No,
right?
It doesn't.
We never experience either of those two things separate from the other.
No, you're right.
So the fact that we try to make sense of it by separating them, I think does us a complete disservice straight away anyway.
Yeah.
Because they're so, like you've said, so intrinsically linked. My experience when I was a child very much happened and centered in my body. The way that my body reacted to what I experienced was central to how I then reacted and felt as a result of what I was seeing.
Yeah. That's so important, because it's one of those things that, you've mentioned there, that you have had to detach mentally from the actual events. Mm-hmm. And you said the word secrets. I think you said the word secrets anyway. And that's one of the most profoundly disturbing things that you could do to a child is encourage them to keep secrets, because that comes out in all sorts of ways later on. And then the emotion that is held, because you're not essentially you're not telling the truth, even if it's not seen as lying as such. It can become very compulsive behaviour, the keeping secrets and the lying as you move forward. This is a big question, I suppose, but I kind of think there'll be a lot of people listening that have gone through this similar experience. Where did you feel that sense of being trapped, so the truth being trapped in your body?
Well, look, I think I would take it a step further in the first instance to say that it was even deeper than keeping secrets. It was more of a denial of your reality.
Yes.
Right. So there was this kind of code where we knew that we didn't talk about what we experienced within the house. But then there was this further denial of the reality, right? So as a child, if you say, what was going on last night? Is everybody okay? And the reaction that you got in most cases was, it's fine, don't worry, everything's fine, there's nothing going on. Like, it was, your dad was just a bit angry, that there's no issue here, right? And so it's that denial of your reality
Yeah.
that forces you to have to disconnect
Yes.
from your body.
Yeah.
And I believe that your body is reacting all of the time, right? So if we think of like an ideal environment, it would not be one where there is no negative experience, where there's no difficulty. It would be one where each and every time there was a difficult experience and your body reacted in the way that it does. So, for example, when I begin to become fearful, I can feel internally in my body something rise, particularly from my tummy up through and into my shoulders.
Yes.
Right? That's like a very common thing that we feel when we feel fear. To then have that in an ideal environment, validated by an adult. Okay, well, you're feeling that because your dad has just become angry, right? And so it makes sense that your body would do that. It's a very normal reaction. You're scared, and then I can be maybe eased through that and told that, like, you know, if this is just a thing that's happening and you don't have to worry, you didn't cause this, you can't control this, and all that kind of stuff. So it's not the absence of those difficult experiences, it's the validation and the help to make sense of them.
Yeah.
When you don't get that, and you actually get the opposite, which is you're told everything's fine, stop doing it, then you're left with no choice but to get up in your head.
Yeah.
Right? And start to try and rationalize and start to try and make logical sense of stuff, because to be in your body and to consistently re-experience that uprising of stuff that I think in most cases starts in our tummies. A lot of it originates in our tummies. You have no choice but to disconnect from that.
Exactly. And when you mentioned going into the front head there, like the front brain, if you're a child, you literally cannot, well, you can do some complex thinking, but you certainly can't rationalize your parents arguing or hitting each other, or it's hard to rationalize that when you're an adult and you watch that in a pub or, you know, outside your house. It's hard to rationalize that anyway. You have to be pretty well tuned in to be able to do that, I think. So for a child to do that, they'll only able their brain will develop around their perception of whatever logical looks like to them at the time. So you can see how maladaptive that becomes for adults that then become angry themselves, because that's sort of what's been modeled to them. I mean, there's obviously epigenetics attached to this as well, which is something we'll perhaps look at a bit later, but because it's important. So those learnt behaviours switching on certain codes, which are, I mean, they're saying could be 14 generations worth of our ancestors carried in our expression, in our gene expression. So there's all this kind of huge stuff going on that we're not aware of. And the learnt behaviours, so your dad must have had some experiences that he's learned a lot of those behaviours from somewhere. And we start to see how the brain evolves to that and how it adapts. And we're seeing a lot of neurodivergence now. And I think that's because of a lot of trauma. But for you personally, that experience of having your reality denied and having to logicalize this, how does that manifest in you? I mean, the stages of that, what can you recall? Because obviously you said it was a great, you know, you thought it was a great childhood, and it's only at 24 that you start to think, oh, hang on a minute. Yeah. Was there any awareness before that you, again, that intuitive awareness that you just shut away?
There was like, you know, I think the key thing at 24 is I stopped drinking alcohol, right?
Right.
So up until that stage, I was using alcohol as a way to be able to escape my body, right? To escape my reality. Because when your reality becomes too difficult to be in, then it's natural that you would seek escape from it, right? So things like alcohol and drugs, far from being like a maladaptive thing, are actually like, they make perfect sense when you're able to look at your experience in its entirety. And I think like what you were just describing, what happened to me when I was younger is that I would have to disconnect from that, right? So I learned to tune out from my body. And I think when, you know, we touched on the whole sort of neurodivergent thing and some of the genetical factors that are at play here, I do believe that genetically I've always had a high level of sensitivity.
Yes.
So I find the world generally too noisy, too bright, too smelly, all of those things, yeah. Like I find the world at base level overwhelming as it is, yeah. Then when you add in what essentially feels like a war zone to me, like it makes perfect sense that my body that I would tune out from my body regularly.
Yeah.
So like that gets you through your childhood, right? Because what a great and adaptive state that is to have when you can hear your mum being beat up downstairs, how great it is that you can adapt to tune out from that.
Yeah.
That becomes problematic when you reach your adulthood because you have these overwhelming stages in your life that you are then tuning out from.
Yeah.
So even like the birth of my children, I don't remember a lot of the births of my children because my brain did what it's always done in my life, which is tune out.
Which is actually a really, like you say, it's a useful tool at times.
Yeah.
Because you're pretty good in chaos, I'd imagine.
Yeah, you've got me.
Yeah. Because you're not doing what everybody else is doing, which is essentially losing their mind. You're disassociated from it all and just coping. But there's the key word. Coping, and that will always come back to get you. And I guess that's kind of what happened.
Yeah, because when we disconnect from our bodies, we don't allow the emotion in us to move and to escape and to be able to free itself.
Yeah.
Right. So like things like crying, laughing, any kind of angry expression is a way of releasing the energy from our bodies and allowing it to come out. When you kind of disassociate, disconnect, shut down, tune out, whatever terminology we want to describe it as, you then prevent that energy, that emotion from completing its cycle, from moving through your body and coming out. And so like I always use the example that when I first started looking at my childhood experiences when I was like 24, 25, I would have said to you that I'd never been angry about what I experienced when I was a child. But I was fighting at football every weekend. And I hadn't connected the two together, right? Because that emotion needed to find a way to come out. And I think we see this in culture, right? So if you look at football violence, that tends to increase when society is going through difficult times.
Yes.
Because that's where a lot of particularly young men, not all of them, but a lot of them find a place to be able to release and free all of those difficult emotions that are otherwise trapped in their bodies. So the body will always be naturally drawn to finding ways for it to escape and come out and release itself. In some ways, fighting at football is a less problematic way than if it ends up coming out of me at home around my children.
Of course.
Right? So like in some kind of weird paradoxical way, if we look at people that go and fight at football, and it's not to say that that's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But they have at least semi-intuitively or subconsciously found a space to express that difficult emotion they're otherwise not expressing, that doesn't necessarily directly, at least, involve hurting loved ones.
Yes. And it's acceptable because they're all in the same space at the same time doing the same thing. Like they're all accepting that this is what we're here to do. Like the gladiator kind of vibe.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned the gladiators because we've seen it throughout the history of society.
Yes.
Right? We see it throughout most generations. There is a place where particularly men, but not always men, go to express this kind of underlying anger and this underlying difficult emotion that they otherwise feel like they're not able to express.
And not allowed to in so many different ways as well. Like you say, it's not acceptable to do in the home. But if you don't have that outlet, like you say, it's got to come out somewhere. And actually, it's reminded me of conversations I've had with women that have gone through traumas, be it sexual traumas or similar kind of listening to parents argue and fight and domestic abuse. A lot of those girls will say, I was so promiscuous as a teenager. And I say, I actually think you were just releasing energy. I think you were releasing the emotion that you weren't allowed to express. Yeah. And it was a way of being close to someone. And although they may not have had the same intention as you, the outcome is that you've released... we all know what it's like when you're having sex. You've released a lot of physical energy, but you've also screamed or shouted or whatever. And there's been a whole vagal nerve stimulation thing going on there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So when women and girls talk about promiscuity, I say actually very similarly, I say it's a bit like boys fighting in the playground. You found your way to release that and you haven't known any other way of doing it.
Yeah. And it's a way that's seen as relatively more acceptable than other certain things. So like particularly young girls in our culture, in our society, you often hear people say that it's seen as more normal and more socially acceptable for girls to do emotions, but I don't actually think that's true. If you look particularly at young girls, they're actually taught, like generally speaking, to play small, to not do any big emotions.
Yeah,
they're certainly not allowed anger, right?
Yeah.
So I always say, if you went into a school and you saw a 13-year-old boy have an angry outburst in a lesson and, I don't know, throw a chair and get himself kicked out of the lesson, which is something that used to happen to me regularly when I was a child, you might point to something being, a struggle being there, but you wouldn't necessarily be too concerned about it.
No,
right?
You're right. Yeah.
It could happen fairly regularly.
It's testosterone, you see.
Yeah. But if a 13-year-old girl was to throw a chair and have an angry outburst in a lesson, she'd probably find herself in front of a GP very, very quickly.
No, you're absolutely right. And it goes back to hysteria.
Yeah.
The idea that women were hysterical and actually they were very suppressed sexually and otherwise. And so they became hysterical because they were told to hold in all of their emotions. And I was the angry girl and everyone, oh, you're so angry. And I used to think, those that listen know my story, I've got every reason to be angry.
Yeah.
But of course, nobody wanted that. So again, you have to detach. And that's where self-harm came in for me.
And again, this is like a real societal issue, right? And I think though there is some leveling up of the self-harm that we see, right? There's normally higher levels of self-harm in young girls, right? And I think that is a lot to do with not allowing them to express any big emotions when they're younger. But we're frightened of any big emotion. So anger's a particular one, right? One of the things that get leveled at me, particularly with my content, is that people will say to me, you seem angry. Like, you seem angry when you talk about this stuff. And I always say, like, well, my question is to you, when you're talking about parental abuse, why aren't you angry?
Yeah. What about this doesn't make you angry?
Yeah. Why you should be angry. Like anger's not bad, right?
It's there for a reason. We forget this. We feel it for a reason. We're supposed to feel it.
Yeah. And it's to motivate us.
Yeah.
As well, right? So if you look at any historical positive breakthrough, right, in the power structures that we exist in our society, they were driven by angry people. So the suffragettes, for example,
Yes.
the suffragettes were angry.
Yeah.
Right. And look at what they did with that anger. They were motivated by that anger. It started by people saying, this isn't okay. And at the beginning, they would have been ridiculed and made to think that they were silly, but they used their anger to get through that and create positive change.